Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not sending Goulash to his glorious death on a kamikaze mission, I'm here at the Wolfula Air reviewing movies. After my big video reviewing Godzilla's first two films and their questionable localizations...
You're so brave, Tsukioka.
Banana oil. I was desperate and worried and anxious.
My fans were interested in me covering the latest Japanese entry in the Godzilla series. I mean, I covered Godzilla's Alpha. I might as well cover what is to date his Omega overseas. Though ironically, the latest Godzilla is kind of the series' new Alpha, chronologically speaking. Godzilla Minus One, released in 2023 and directed by Takashi Yamazaki. Based on the trailers, I assumed Godzilla Minus One would be a direct remake of the original 1954 Godzilla, where it would be a bit like the Peter Jackson King Kong remake, a modern movie with modern effects that takes place in the era of the original film, and follows that story while expanding on it. But really, Godzilla Minus One isn't a remake or even a reimagining. It's an entirely new Godzilla movie that just happens to take place in post-war Japan like the original film. But Minus One takes place just a couple years after World War II ended, whereas the original film takes place a couple years after the US occupation of Japan ended. Making Minus One kind of a prequel chronologically, but not narratively, seeing as how the original film and Minus One obviously take place in entirely separate timelines. Besides homages, the only direct connections to the original Godzilla that I could detect, besides Godzilla obviously being in both, is that Minus One features Odo Island, and Akira Ifukube's original Godzilla theme makes a special appearance. The writer-director of Minus One has been kind of vague about the meaning of Godzilla Minus One's title, and has said that there are multiple meanings to it. One being that after Japan became ground zero for the atomic bombings, having Godzilla attack Japan right after brings it to a state of Minus One, and I think that's a little overly complicated. I like to think it's called Godzilla Minus One because it takes place in a time before Godzilla 1, making this new film Godzilla Minus One, which I guess would technically make it Godzilla 0. Okay, you know what? The title doesn't matter. It just sounds cool. There haven't been many Japanese live-action Godzilla movies in the past 20 years. There was maybe a sense that with the American Godzilla films and Toho's contract forbidding their Godzilla films from releasing the same year as an American Godzilla film, that this created some logistical issues and a sense that a Japanese Godzilla would have difficulty competing with the production values of the larger budgeted Hollywood Godzilla films. But that really shouldn't be a concern or slow down any future Godzilla films from his country of origin. Because I'm just gonna say it right now. Godzilla Minus One is a fantastic kaiju film, a masterpiece for sure.
いくら確認してもあなたの言う故障箇所が見つからないんですよ。
Much like the original Godzilla, Minus One isn't really all that much about Godzilla. It's about the Japanese people after World War II fighting something that represents the very thing that brought them to their knees at the end of the war. Minus One is told almost exclusively from the perspective of one Japanese man in particular, beginning towards World War II's end. A kamikaze pilot named Koichi Shikishima who survives the war. Now, if you aren't familiar with kamikaze pilots, well, they weren't supposed to survive jack shit.
What did he do in the war?
Kamikaze pilot.
Would he be dead?
Not all of them died.
Their mission was to intentionally crash their plane into the enemy, hopefully taking out as many Allied ships and planes as possible in the process. A desperation tactic to try to win the war. An honorable death was preferable to Japan over surrender. Shikishima chickens out of his forced suicide attack and plays it off as having engine problems, landing on Odo Island for repairs. Yeah, if you're crashing a plane, you ought to make sure it's running at peak efficiency.
Chicken! How about you, Yosh? Little chicken?
Later that night, Godzilla just casually shows up on Odo Island and fucks up everybody there. This is my one big criticism of Minus One. Godzilla just shows up without any build-up. One guy just says, oh yeah, that's Godzilla. Somebody told me that was a thing. That's a big difference between the original Godzilla and -1. In the original film, Godzilla existing and what that could mean for the world is treated as just as big of a deal as the threat he poses. But in -1, Godzilla's existence is taken in stride, and nobody tries to figure out what he is and where he came from, which is understandable with a shell-shocked Japan immediately after World War II.
地元の人間はゴジラと呼んでいました。
It's just another unexpected cataclysm the Japanese need to survive. Who cares what Godzilla is? But it is still an interesting choice to not build Godzilla up more before we see him like he was built up in the original. I suppose the film wanted to catch its audience off guard like it does the characters in Godzilla's sights, but I really love build-up. It makes it so a movie's monster, even though you already know what it is, feels special when it finally shows up. I do also wish we spent more time on Odo Island, because this brief scene is one of my favorites of the film, with Godzilla before he became massive, when he's closer to T-Rex size. It's both cool and scary seeing Godzilla at a size where he's biting guys' heads off in the middle of the night. It's no secret that I'm more into the King Kong and Jurassic Park-sized prehistoric monsters, and besides that shitty American Godzilla movie from the 90s, this is the first time we've been able to see Godzilla closer to a size where people are more like rats than ants to him. Maybe earlier in the movie, the filmmakers could have had little glimpses of this Godzilla attacking Japanese service members with confusion and fear over what could be killing them off. Basically, spend more time with Godzilla while World War II is still going on. The one scene we get of tiny Godzilla is still awesome though, even if it is very quick and sudden. Still, I do hope they make a -1 prequel during World War II with the smaller Godzilla on Odo Island. Ultimately, Shikishima's lack of action leads to him being one of only 2 survivors of Godzilla's attack. Adding to Shikishima's survivor's guilt, which only builds further when Godzilla eventually returns and brings about even more death. Like I said, Godzilla -1 isn't a movie about Godzilla, it's about the human narrative, the people affected by Godzilla. But initially, Godzilla is all but forgotten for a long stretch of time, and the film focuses more on Japan's struggle to rebuild in the wake of World War II. Shikishima just moves on from barely surviving a random dinosaur and tries to return to his old life in Tokyo. That's gone for good though. Shikishima's family died during an air raid, but we see him reluctantly build a new family in its place. Shikishima joins a young woman named Noriko in raising a baby girl orphaned in the bombings.
ご両親、
空襲でやられたようです。
お兄さんも私と同じね。
The young couple builds a life together, but Shikishima is unwilling to fully commit to the relationship. He still can't pull the trigger. Shikishima dislikes his adopted daughter, calling him her dad, and he refuses to marry Noriko.
親子ともども縁あってこうして引き取ったんだから。
Shikishima could be too much of a coward for commitment, but he also believes he should have died in the war and doesn't deserve to have a family.
夢なんじゃないですかね。そうだ、絶対。
Shikishima hides the fact that he was a kamikaze pilot. Being a living kamikaze pilot makes him a pariah. There's this sense that Japan only lost the war because of cowards like Shikishima unwilling to not only die for their country, but kill themselves for their country. So Shikishima atones by seeking dangerous work that he hopes will get him killed while feeding his family in the process.
米軍と帝国海軍は日本の沿岸に合わせて約6万個の機雷を撒きました。
A job as a minesweeper. Not the addictive game you played on your PC 30 years ago. Finding and destroying leftover mines after the war. -1 is very good at exploring what life was like for Japanese civilians after the war, but the film does completely ignore a significant aspect of post-war life in Japan. The American occupation of Japan. For nearly a decade after the war, up to 1 million U.S. troops were stationed in Japan, but an American presence is unseen and virtually unmentioned in Godzilla -1. The film hand-waves away a U.S. occupation by saying the Americans were too busy dealing with Soviets to address Japan's problems, and ultimately it's a Godzilla movie, it's not a historical document, and the American occupation is still a touchy subject in Japan. A country that, let's face it, likes to pretend that some things didn't happen in its history. But I think it would have been interesting to see the American occupation explored from a Japanese perspective.
不可能と判断されました。
Instead, -1 seems to exist in an alternate timeline that not only has Godzilla in it, but also where America leaves Japan to rebuild itself solo after the USA's mess, and where even Japan's own government has abandoned its citizens.
日本政府も米軍も当てにできない今
For a Japanese film, -1 is surprisingly critical of Japan during the post-war years, in as far as what would be acceptable to depict in Japan. There's a feeling that the Japanese government abandoned its people after World War II, and that the war for the Pacific maybe could have been won if the government didn't cut corners and resort to kamikaze tactics, treating its people as disposable. -1 doesn't go as far as to criticize Japan's role in World War II, its motivations and actions during the war, but the fact that a Godzilla film is willing to criticize Japan in any way is pretty commendable when the film could have just depicted post-war Japanese purely as victims in the wake of the US atomic bombings. At this rate, maybe the next Godzilla film will finally address what happened in Nanjing.
民間主導の本作戦では一人の犠牲者も出さないことを誇りとしたい
The themes of Godzilla -1 are that all life is precious, except Godzilla's, and that a nation isn't its government, but its people. But ultimately, Godzilla films were made to be inspirational to the Japanese, that the Japanese can stand up to any disaster, even a disaster involving a giant dinosaur. Godzilla, of course. Godzilla's transformation into a mega dinosaur is only briefly depicted, but it's effective. A US nuclear test is carried out at Bikini Atoll, and the radiation changes Godzilla. When he emerges from the nuclear fire, Godzilla is, as Shikishima's minesweeping crew witnesses, already destroying ships.
予備含めて
Godzilla's first appearance in his grander form is a very impressive scene for its suspense, indirectly evoking the Lucky Dragon fishing boat that inspired Godzilla to begin with. Shikishima's crew is only able to desperately buy themselves precious time in a hopeless situation. It's a very tensely paced out sequence where it doesn't seem likely most of these guys can make it out of this situation alive, but the sequence is also impressive as the film's first real showcase of the effects that won it an Oscar. -1 obviously continues the trend of Godzilla being depicted with CGI instead of suitmation, but the CGI, especially for its budget, is fantastic. Some of the best computer animation I've seen in years. Water is tough as hell to animate, but Godzilla's swimming is very convincingly executed. The way the waves surrounding Godzilla are simulated, the water that spurts out of his nose when he emerges, the attention to detail goes a long way in selling this movie's Godzilla as a believable creature.
仕留めたか
Godzilla -1 may possibly be the most grounded film in the series, but despite dealing with such ordinary characters, Godzilla is still depicted as extraordinary as he ever has been. He's still more than just a dinosaur, capable of extreme feats like instantly healing and atomic breath. And Godzilla even attacks Tokyo. The destruction of Tokyo in -1 is admittedly not as thorough and terrifying as Godzilla's attack on Tokyo at night in the original film. The original Godzilla might still be the scariest of them all, but besides one awkward-looking extreme long shot of Godzilla in -1, the Kaiju's destruction of Tokyo is brutally devastating, especially on an emotional level. Godzilla only attacks Tokyo's Ginza shopping district, though. It's a great action sequence, but very brief. The only scene of Godzilla doing what most people watch his movies for, wrecking buildings with citizens fleeing in terror. But the scene does feature one of the best looking visual effects sequences I've seen in a long while. Godzilla demonstrating that the power of his heat breath is the equivalent of an atomic bomb. The devastation felt throughout Tokyo. Savage as fuck! The sequence is also the most heartbreaking of the film, and perfectly evokes the anti-nuclear themes of the original Godzilla. The beast born from the nuclear bomb can unendingly and effortlessly repeat the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. -1 was estimated to have been made for about $12 million when converted to US currency, which is microscopic compared to the American Godzilla films, but the quality of -1 mops the floor with its big-budget cousins in the US. Despite Godzilla being an obviously massive threat in -1, though, Godzilla isn't in the movie a lot. He only has 12 minutes of screen time, which is actually about the average for Godzilla movies, and more screen time than he had in Godzilla X Kong or any of his MonsterVerse appearances. Godzilla doesn't actually appear a lot in his own movies. He's fucking expensive, but at over 2 hours, -1 is the longest Japanese Godzilla movie, and I did feel the length of Godzilla's absences during the film. After his first appearance, Godzilla isn't seen again for over a half hour, and after Godzilla ravages Tokyo, he isn't seen until the final act about 40 minutes later. Godzilla -1 has Godzilla in it so rarely I forget he exists. Then when a scene comes up with Godzilla in it, I say, there's a Godzilla in this movie? It might be called Godzilla -1 because they're -1 Godzilla in most of the scenes. Jokes aside, though, -1's human narrative is really compelling, possibly the strongest in the series, and the performances are fantastic, real. The cast sells what is a ludicrous concept as a heart-wrenching tragedy that really moved me. I won't go into massive spoilers, but how Godzilla is beaten in the film, temporarily or not, is a huge improvement over his convenient demise in the original Godzilla. There is no Deus Ex Machina, no oxygen destroyer lying around just waiting to beat Godzilla until enough time has passed. What beats Godzilla is just pure human ingenuity. Normal, dejected people disenfranchised by their government taking matters in their own hands to defend their nation. The final battle is highly satisfying and handled with gripping suspense. Godzilla's defeat is unexpected and earned. What is interesting to me, though, is how unexpectedly happy the ending of Godzilla -1 is. The movie goes so far building up the expectation of a bittersweet ending where Godzilla is beaten with massive losses of life with, like most Godzilla movies, a character making a sacrifice, but then it doesn't go in that direction at all with the most upbeat, hopeful, against all odds ending possible. I had mixed feelings about the ending of -1 because it did feel uncharacteristically Hollywood-esque, but at the same time, the movie makes a point that World War II brought so many unnecessary casualties because the government stopped caring about its people. When taking on the necessary fight against Godzilla, the characters go out of their way not to repeat the mistakes of World War II, knowing life is worth more than an honorable death, that even in the bleakness of post-war Japan, you can still find hope. Godzilla -1 is easily one of the best Godzilla sequels in a long time, and it's just one of the best movie sequels in general. The performances, the story, the action, and the effects are superb. It looks like a significantly more expensive movie than it actually is. There are fucking Blumhouse movies more expensive than this, but if you told me Godzilla -1 was made for $100 million, I'd believe you. I would have liked if -1 got more in-depth in its exploration of Japan's post-war years, and I also would have liked more Godzilla throughout the film, especially on Odo Island and in Tokyo, but the movie still works perfectly well as is. I give Godzilla -1 Godzilla taking a bite out of Japanese guys' heads out of Godzilla taking a bite out of Japanese trains. Godzilla has some really cute chipmunk cheeks in this movie. Before I go, I just want to give a shout out to this video sponsor, me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Here's the movie I'll be streaming next Sunday. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus streams, and I thank you in advance. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.